Welcome to Part 2 of all the prisoners who have been executed in Florida since 1979. We will talk about their gruesome crimes, last words, last meals, and their last gasps. So far, 110 have been executed in Florida. We covered 20 in the first video, and we are going to cover 25 in this video. If you have not watched Part 1, please check the link in the description of this video. Aubrey Dennis Adams, Jr. Aubrey Dennis Adams, Jr. was convicted in 1978 for the abduction, sexual assault, and murder of an 8-year-old girl in Hillsborough County, with the dental record comparisons and fiber matches from the victim's clothing tying him to the crime scene. He was arrested later that year after the Child Protection Task Force traced hair and fiber evidence to his known associates. At trial, prosecutors presented the dental and fiber analyses along with eyewitness testimony from the victim's teacher. The jury returned a first-degree murder verdict in December 1978 and unanimously recommended death. All post-conviction appeals, challenging procedural and Eighth Amendment issues, were denied by the Florida Supreme Court and, on May 3, 1989, by the U.S. Supreme Court. He was executed at 7:09 a.m. on May 4, 1989, in Florida State Prison's electric chair. He offered only, "I'm ready," declined special meal requests, and received the standard breakfast served at dawn. Jesse Joseph Defero. Jesse Joseph Defero was convicted of the February 20, 1976 ambush murders of Florida Highway Patrol Officer Philip A. Black and Ontario Provincial Police Constable Donald Irwin during a traffic stop, with ballistics and gunpowder residue linking his .38 caliber weapon to the killings. Arrested at a subsequent roadblock, his conviction rested on an accomplice's testimony and forensic evidence, despite later recantations. After the Florida Supreme Court affirmed his death sentence in 1982, his 1990 electrocution was grotesquely botched. 6-inch flames shot from his head, requiring 3 2,000-volt jolts over 7 minutes before he was pronounced dead. He made no final remarks, and his last meal request of pie was partly saved, as he believed he would return to his cell afterward. Anthony Bertilotti. Anthony Bertilotti was found guilty of the September 27, 1983, stabbing, rape, and robbery of Jacksonville housewife Carol Ward, with blood-stained clothing and fiber evidence corroborated by the tipster testimony of his girlfriend, Sharon Greast, who received a $1,000 Crime Watch reward. He was arrested after a Crime Watch lead, and at trial the prosecution introduced eyewitness accounts, fiber matches, and Bertilotti's partial admissions. In August 1985, a jury unanimously recommended death. All appeals, including a last-minute U.S. Supreme Court refusal, were exhausted by July 1990. Executed at 7:07 p.m. on July 27, 1990, at Florida State Prison, he declined to speak at the gurney and did not request a special meal, receiving only the mandatory breakfast. James William Hamlin. James William Hamlin was convicted for the April 24, 1984, murder of Laureen Jean Edwards, whom he shot in the back of the head during an attempted robbery of her Jacksonville lingerie shop. Officers found him at the locked store entrance, and a .38 caliber pistol in his possession matched the fatal bullet. Arrested on sight, he confessed to the slaying and an earlier Texas homicide. At his June 1988 trial, the jury unanimously recommended death. After dismissing further appeals and with certiorari denied, Hamlin was electrocuted at 7:12 a.m. on September 21, 1990. He smiled and winked at witnesses, made no parting remarks, and consumed only the standard prison breakfast. Roy Allen Harris. On June 26, 1981, 32-year-old Roy Allen Harris picked up 18-year-old Carleen Gale Kelly and her 17-year-old friend Deborah Miller as they hitchhiked near Daytona Beach. After driving them to a secluded area, he shot Kelly execution style, slashed her throat, and left her for dead. Miller survived by playing dead and later identified Harris at trial. Investigators tracked Harris through Miller's testimony and physical evidence. Miller's eyewitness account at the crime scene directly led to his arrest days later. Harris was convicted of first-degree murder and kidnapping in late 1981. The jury voted 9-3 to recommend death. The trial judge overrode a life recommendation to impose death by electrocution. Harrick's appeals, challenging counsel conflicts and the admission of his statements, were rejected by the Florida Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court. At 7 a.m. on April 24, 1991, Harrick was led to Old Sparky at Florida State Prison. He read a final statement before the 2,000-volt current was applied and was pronounced dead 3 minutes later. Harrick's final statement lambasted the courts and decried a lack of fairness, declaring, "This is truly a sad time in our country's history when political concerns take on more importance than the fundamental rights of the individual." No special final meal was recorded. Harrick received the standard prison tray. Bobby Marian Francis. On August 17, 1975, 46-year-old Bobby Marian Francis tortured and killed 48-year-old Titus R. Walters, a drug informant, by attempting to inject him with Drano and battery acid before shooting him 3 times in Key West. Francis was arrested within days after witnesses linked him to Walters's murder, in part due to police tips about his vendetta against the informant. Convicted in 1976, Francis's jury recommended life, but the judge imposed death. He endured 3 death warrants and numerous federal and state appeals, all ultimately denied by the U.S. Supreme Court in June 1991. Francis was electrocuted at Florida State Prison at 7:07 a.m. on June 25, 1991, less than 24 hours after the U.S. Supreme Court declined to extend his stay. No final statement was made on the gurney, and no recording of last words survives in public records. Francis declined a special meal and received the standard prison menu. Nollie Lee Martin. On June 25, 1977, 43-year-old Nollie Lee Martin abducted, raped, and fatally stabbed 19-year-old Patricia Greenfield, a college student working at a Delray Beach convenience store, dumping her body in a landfill. Captured at a bus stop hours later, Martin confessed under interrogation and was indicted on murder, kidnapping, and sexual battery charges. After pleading insanity, Martin was found competent, convicted in 1978, and sentenced to death. His counsel's mental health challenges failed at every level, including the Florida Supreme Court and a U.S. Supreme Court denial in May 1992. At 7:10 a.m. on May 12, 1992, Martin was electrocuted at Florida State Prison. Witnesses described the 2,000-volt surge and his body's convulsions. Moments before the switch, Martin said, "I guess I probably deserve this for what I did. I truly mean it. And maybe I will meet you in heaven," expressing remorse for his crime. Martin did not request a special last meal. He ate the standard breakfast tray. Edward Dean Kennedy. After escaping Union Correctional Institution on April 11, 1981, 47-year-old Edward Dean Kennedy invaded a home, stole weapons, and fatally shot Florida Highway Trooper Robert McDermott and McDermott's cousin Floyd Cohn hours apart. Kennedy was surrounded by police after taking hostages in the second house. He surrendered after demanding media coverage. Tried on 2 counts of first-degree murder, Kennedy was convicted and sentenced to die. He survived a 1986 double warrant stay, but lost all appeals to the Florida Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court. At 7 a.m. on July 21, 1992, Kennedy was strapped into Old Sparky at Florida State Prison. After a hushed ceremony, the electric current claimed his life. As he faced the chair, Kennedy calmly intoned, "Peace be with you all," and, in Arabic, "Allahu Akbar, go is great." Kennedy did not request a special meal and consumed the standard prison fare. Robert Dale Henderson. Between January 14th and February 4th, 1982, 48-year-old Robert Dale Henderson confessed to a multi-state spree killing at least 12 victims. In Florida, he picked up and shot 3 hitchhikers execution style in Hernando County. Henderson voluntarily surrendered on February 6, 1982, to Punta Gorda authorities after leading them to his victims' bodies. Convicted of 3 Florida murders and given 3 death sentences, Henderson's appeals on evidentiary and procedural grounds were uniformly denied by Florida's courts, and certiorari was refused by the U.S. Supreme Court. He was executed by electric chair at Florida State Prison at 7:10 a.m. on April 21, 1993, after the 11th Circuit and Supreme Court refused to stay his sentence. Henderson made no public final statement on the gurney. No special final meal was recorded. Henderson received the standard meal. Larry Joe Johnson. On March 16, 1979, Vietnam veteran Larry Joe Johnson fatally shot service station attendant James Haddon during an armed robbery at a Madison County gas station. Eyewitness Patty Burks testified he aimed a sawed-off shotgun at Haddon, forced her to empty the cash register, then shot the clerk at point-blank range. Investigators traced the shotgun shells to Johnson's car and corroborated Burks's account, leading to his arrest the following day and indictment for first-degree murder and armed robbery. At his April 1983 trial, a jury unanimously convicted him of first-degree murder and recommended death. The judge imposed the sentence, which the Florida Supreme Court affirmed in November 1983, and the U.S. Supreme Court subsequently denied certiorari, leaving the verdict intact. He was executed by electric chair at Florida State Prison at 10 p.m. on May 5, 1993, after Governor Lawton Chills refused last-minute clemency appeals. Johnson offered no final words when the current was applied. His family later recalled a silent nod as he accepted his fate. His last meal, barbecued lamb chops, potato salad, coleslaw, a dill pickle, a butter roll, blackberry cobbler, and Pepsi, went mostly uneaten as nerves overtook him. Michael Allan Durocher. In October 1990, while jailed on an unrelated murder conviction, Michael Allan Durocher confessed to killing his former girlfriend, her 5-year-old daughter, and their 6-month-old son during a trip to a remote area in Clay County, guiding authorities to the burial sites with a hand-drawn map. He had been initially arrested in August 1988 for a Jacksonville storekeeper's murder, but it was this confession that prompted a triple homicide indictment. On March 4th through 5th, 1991, Durocher pled guilty, declined to present mitigating evidence, and the jury unanimously recommended death, a sentence the trial judge imposed. The Florida Supreme Court affirmed in 1992, and his subsequent state and federal appeals were denied through 1993. At 7:15 a.m. on August 25, 1993, he was executed by electric chair at Florida State Prison in Stark, and pronounced dead minutes later. He made no final statement as the current surged through his body. For his last meal, Durocher requested 5 pounds of jumbo breaded shrimp, a pint of chocolate ice cream, and a 2-liter bottle of cola. Roy Allan Stewart. On February 22, 1978, 77-year-old Margaret Hazlip invited Roy Allan Stewart into her Dade County home. After fixing him a sandwich, she confronted him over a stolen watch, whereupon Stewart beat her mercilessly, tore off her clothing, raped her, and strangled her with an electrical cord, leaving her with 8 broken ribs, a fractured larynx, and bite marks on her body. A Dade County grand jury soon indicted him for first-degree murder, armed robbery, sexual battery, and burglary. He was arrested and held without bail pending trial. In July 1979, a jury convicted Stewart, recommended death, and the judge imposed the sentence on July 26, 1979, citing multiple aggravating factors. The Florida Supreme Court affirmed in 1982, and the U.S. Supreme Court denied review in 1986. After exhausting federal habeas petitions, Stewart was electrocuted at Florida State Prison at 7:11 a.m. on April 22, 1994, becoming the 33rd inmate executed in Florida since 1976. As he was strapped into the chair, he nodded to Reverend Fred Lawrence and whispered, "I appreciate all you've done. I love you," moments before the current flowed. He did not request a special last meal and received the standard prison breakfast tray under Florida's $40 limit. Bernard Bolender. On January 8, 1980, Bernard Bo Bolender and 2 accomplices lured 4 men to a Miami drug deal. After binding, robbing, and torturing them with baseball bats, knives, and fire, Bolender murdered the victims and hid their bodies in a burnt car found on Interstate 95. Fingerprints on the vehicle and testimony from co-defendant Joseph Macker, who exchanged his cooperation for leniency, led to Bolender's arrest and indictment on 4 counts of first-degree murder. Convicted in April 1980, the jury's life recommendation was overridden by the judge, who imposed death. The Florida Supreme Court affirmed in 1982. A 1987 ruling briefly vacated his sentence for ineffective counsel before reinstatement, and his final federal appeals were denied in 1995. He was executed by electric chair at Florida State Prison on July 18, 1995, and pronounced dead at 10:19 a.m. after a 2,000-volt surge. Reading from a prepared 2-page statement, he thanked his legal team for exposing frame-ups, witnesses, corruption, and lies, lamenting, "It came too late for me," as the switch was thrown. He did not request a special last meal and received the standard prison tray. Jerry White. On March 8, 1981, Jerry White entered an Orange County grocery store, attempted a holdup, and shot shopper James Melson execution-style in the back of the head. Store owner Alex Alexander was also shot and left paralyzed before White fled with $338. Witnesses positively identified him at the scene, and forensic evidence confirmed close-range shots, leading to his arrest and indictment on first-degree murder and armed robbery charges. His trial began April 21, 1982. After 40 minutes, a jury convicted him and, by an 11-1 vote, recommended death. Judge Stroker formally imposed the sentence on May 4, 1982, and the Florida Supreme Court upheld the conviction in 1984, with subsequent post-conviction motions and federal stays denied. Governor Lawton Chills signed White's final warrant in November, and on December 4, 1995, at 12:05 p.m., he was strapped into the electric chair at Florida State Prison in Rayford. Witnesses reported a prolonged, muffled scream as the current surged, and he was pronounced dead at 12:19 p.m. In his final statement, White urged, "I wish that all the people who can hear my voice will turn to the Lord Jesus Christ as I have," echoing a handwritten note of faith. 3 hours before, he had enjoyed grilled round steak, French fried potatoes, coleslaw, toast, and orange juice for his last meal. Philip Alexander Atkins. On September 23, 1981, Philip Atkins kidnapped 6-year-old Antonio Castillo in Polk County, beating him with a steel pipe and strangling him before abandoning his body along a rural roadway. Key evidence included Atkins's own confession and the recovery of the murder weapon and the victim's clothing in his possession. Investigators arrested Atkins shortly thereafter, based on eyewitness identification and physical evidence linking him to the crime scene. He was charged with kidnapping and first-degree murder. At his 1982 trial, prosecutors introduced his taped confession, forensic analyses of the weapon, and expert testimony, while the defense argued the confession was coerced. The jury convicted him and recommended death by a 7-5 vote, which the judge imposed. On appeal, both the Florida Supreme Court and the 11th Circuit rejected Atkins's challenges to jury instructions and aggravating circumstance findings. Atkins was executed by electrocution at Florida State Prison on December 5, 1995, pronounced dead at 10 a.m. after the standard 2,000-volt surge. Moments before, he apologized, said goodbye to his family, and thanked his attorneys. He declined a special final meal, turning down steak and potatoes, but accepted 2 glasses of orange juice. John Earl Bush. On April 27, 1982, John Earl Bush and accomplices abducted 18-year-old Frances Julia Slater from the convenience store where she worked in Stewart, Florida. Bush stabbed her, and an accomplice shot her in the head. Her body was found hours later in a wooded area. Witness identifications and surveillance footage linked Bush to the crime, and he was arrested later that night during a traffic stop. Charged with first-degree murder and armed robbery, he stood trial in Lee County. Prosecutors presented Bush's taped statements, the victim's blood-stained clothing, and testimony from his co-defendants. The defense claimed he was dominated by the ringleader. A jury found him guilty and unanimously recommended death. All state and federal appeals, including a U.S. Supreme Court petition, were denied by 1996. Bush was electrocuted at 7:09 p.m. on October 21, 1996 at Florida State Prison. He offered no final words as the current coursed through him. For his final meal, he requested and consumed porterhouse steak, shrimp, and lemon pie, washed down with 3 glasses of orange juice. John Mills, Jr. On March 5, 1982, John Mills, Jr. and Michael Frederick kidnapped Les Lawhon from his Wakulla County trailer under the pretense of using the phone, then forced him into a truck and shot him when he tried to flee. Frederick pled guilty to second-degree murder and testified against Mills, while investigators found the victim's shotgun and stolen property in Mills's mother's garage. He was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, armed burglary, arson, and grand theft. At his 1983 trial, Mills was convicted on all counts. The jury unanimously recommended death, and the judge followed suit. His appeals, including federal habeas petitions and multiple stays, were denied through 1996. Mills was executed by electric chair at 7:13 a.m. on December 6, 1996. Prison officials reported no complications, and he made no final statement. He refused any special last meal and instead consumed the standard breakfast tray. Pedro Medina. Pedro Medina murdered 52-year-old Dorothy James, with whom he was acquainted, in her Orlando home on April 3, 1982, stabbing and slashing her before stealing her car. His fingerprints at the scene and recovery of James's belongings in his vehicle led to his arrest. During interrogation, Medina provided details known only to the killer, resulting in charges of first-degree murder and auto theft. At his March 1983 trial in Orange County, the prosecution introduced forensic pathology, survivor testimony, and Medina's taped confessions. The defense raised competency concerns. A jury convicted him unanimously and recommended death. His appeals on competency and habeas grounds were denied by the Florida Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court by early 1997. Medina was executed by electric chair at 7 a.m. on March 25, 1997. The 2,000-volt surge ignited brief flames from his head, astonishing witnesses, before he was pronounced dead. He made no final verbal statement, maintaining innocence in later filings. He declined any special final meal, eating only the standard prison breakfast. Gerald Eugene Stano. Gerald Eugene Stano kidnapped and murdered multiple female hitchhikers in the 1970s. On March 5, 1982, he abducted 17-year-old Kathy Lee Scharf in Volusia County, torturing and killing her. His taped confession and victim's testimony led to his conviction for first-degree murder, kidnapping, arson, burglary, and grand theft. Police arrested Stano on April 1, 1980, after surviving victim Donna Hensley identified him. Subsequent confessions tied him to at least 23 murders. Sentenced to death in 1983, Stano's direct appeal and post-conviction motions, including claims of Brady violations, were rejected through 1997. On March 23, 1998, Stano was executed by electrocution at Florida State Prison. Officials described the process as uneventful, though some smoke emerged during the jolt. His final statement proclaimed innocence and blamed investigators, saying, "I am innocent. I was threatened and forced to confess to crimes I did not commit." For his last meal, he requested Delmonico steak, a baked potato with sour cream and bacon bits, a salad with blue cheese dressing, lima beans, half a gallon of mint chocolate chip ice cream, and 2 liters of Pepsi. Leo Alexander Jones. On May 23, 1981, Jacksonville Deputy Sheriff Thomas Safransky was seated alone in his patrol car when a high-powered .3030 Winchester rifle round shattered his windshield and killed him instantly. Investigators traced the spent casing to an upstairs apartment, where they recovered the rifle bearing Jones's fingerprints and linked it ballistically to the fatal shot. Within hours, officers arrested Jones at that apartment. He confessed during a post-Miranda interview, admitting he was tired of the police hassling him and intended to shoot an officer. At trial, the state presented the ballistics match, fingerprint evidence, and Jones's own written confession. His defense challenged the voluntariness of that confession and argued misidentification, but a Duval County jury convicted him of first-degree murder and unanimously recommended death. The judge imposed the sentence in November 1981. Over the next 17 years, Jones's appeals to the Florida Supreme Court and federal courts, including claims of coerced confession and improper aggravating evidence, were all denied, and every death warrant survived judicial review. Shortly before dawn on March 24, 1998, Jones was led into Florida State Prison's electric chair. Strapped down beneath the headpiece, he offered no formal statement but was heard praying in Arabic as witnesses watched silently. At the governor's office, Governor Lawton Chills received the words he had come to expect. "The switch has been engaged." Jones was pronounced dead just minutes after the current flowed. He requested a last meal of steak, eggs, potatoes, and 4 slices of toast. Although his nerves kept him from eating much, the order remains noted as one of the last carried out before his execution. Judy Buenoano. Between 1971 and 1983, Judy Buenoano collected millions in life insurance payouts after 3 people closest to her died under suspicious circumstances: her Air Force husband, James Goodyear, her teenage son, Michael, who drowned during a canoe trip, and her daughter's father, Bobby Joe Morris. In 1983, her boyfriend John Gentry survived an apparent boating accident that investigators later proved was a paraformaldehyde and arsenic poisoning attempt. Forensic analysis of exhumed bodies established arsenic poisoning in each death, and insurance company records traced hefty payouts back to her. Arrested in January 1984, Buenoano was indicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder, attempted second-degree murder, and multiple fraud charges. Prosecutors relied on the exhumation reports, toxicology findings, insurance fraud paper trails, and her own recorded admissions. At 2 separate trials, juries convicted her in 1984 of her son's murder and her attempted murder of Gentry, then in 1985 of her husband's killing, unanimously recommending death. The judge followed suit, and all state and federal appeals, challenging venue, evidence, and procedure, were rejected by both Florida's High Court and the U.S. Supreme Court. On March 30, 1998, Buenoano was led to the electric chair at Florida State Prison. She told officials, "No, sir," when asked for any final words and declined to speak further. The current claimed her life within seconds. Her last meal was a modest tray of steamed broccoli, asparagus, strawberries, and tomato wedges, accompanied by hot tea with lemon, an order as disciplined and spare as her calculated crimes. Daniel Eugene Rameda. In early February 1985, Daniel Rameda embarked on a cross-country killing spree that began in Florida. On February 8th, he entered an Ocala convenience store and shot proprietor Merle Chet Reeder execution style during a robbery. Over the next days, he used the same .357 Magnum to kill and wound additional victims in Texas, Kansas, and Arkansas. Authorities identified him through surviving victims' testimony, shell casing matches, and his own admissions to law enforcement officers. Extradited to Florida, Rameda went to trial for Reeder's death in late 1987. The prosecution introduced testimony from the Kansas store clerk who survived 5 gunshot wounds, forensic linkage of the gun to the Reeder killing, and Rameda's recorded statements. Rameda, who pleaded guilty to 4 of the 5 murders but maintained he was innocent of the Florida killing, offered no mitigating evidence. The jury convicted him and unanimously recommended death. The judge imposed the sentence in early 1988. His petitions for post-conviction relief, habeas corpus, and stays of execution were systematically denied, culminating in a final Florida Supreme Court order in March 1998. At 7 a.m. on March 31, 1998, Rameda was strapped into the electric chair. He declined to speak as the headpiece was secured and the current applied. Minutes later, he was pronounced dead. His spiritual advisor, who stood vigil in the witness room, shared his final message afterward. Rameda's only last meal request was 2 44-ounce ices, an unorthodox choice that went down in death row lore. Allan Lee Davis. On the night of May 11, 1982, Allan Lee Davis broke into the Jacksonville home of Nancy Weiler and her 2 young daughters. Armed with a .357 Magnum, he brutally beat the 27-year-old pregnant mother over 25 times, then shot 9-year-old Christina twice in the face and chased 5-year-old Catherine through the yard before fatally striking her with the gun's butt. Davis confessed during interrogation, explaining that he intended to rape Christina and then rob the household. Arrested days later, Davis faced a Duval County jury in 1985. Prosecutors presented the forensic autopsy showing horrific blunt force trauma and ballistic evidence linking the gun to each victim. Davis admitted planning the murders and spoke openly of liking to kill people. The jury convicted him on 3 counts of first-degree murder, unanimously recommending death. The trial judge imposed the sentence, and all appeals, through Florida's courts and up to the U.S. Supreme Court, were rejected by mid-1999. On July 8, 1999 at 7:10 a.m., Davis became the last person Florida executed in the electric chair. Witnesses watched streams of blood from his nose and smoke rising from his head as the 3-cycle protocol delivered thousands of volts. He was pronounced dead within a minute. For his final meal, Davis requested 1 lobster tail, half a loaf of garlic bread, a half-pound of fried shrimp, 6 ounces of fried clams, fried potatoes, and 32 ounces of A&W root beer, a feast that contrasted grimly with the brutality of his crimes. Terry Melvin Sims. In the pre-dawn hours of December 29, 1977, Terry Sims and accomplices robbed the Longwood Village Pharmacy. When Reserve Deputy Sheriff George Field, a World War II veteran, entered to investigate, Sims exchanged gunfire, fatally wounding Field with 2 shots. Sims escaped Florida and was arrested in California in June 1978 after a failed robbery attempt. Extradited back to Seminole County, Sims faced trial in late 1978. His co-defendants testified that Sims boasted of killing him with 1 bullet, and forensic analysis confirmed that the fatal rounds came from Sims's weapon. A jury convicted him of first-degree murder and robbery. The judge sentenced him to death, and every appeal, up through challenges to lethal injection itself, was denied. Florida's switch from electrocution to lethal injection followed the botched chair execution of Allan Lee Davis. Sims became the first Floridian put to death by injection on February 23, 2000. He volunteered no protest on the gurney, but spoke calmly. "I love my family. I love all my friends and my rabbi," before the drugs took effect. His final meal was never extraordinary. He ate the standard prison breakfast tray, choosing no special dishes as his final earthly sustenance. Raymond Robert Clark. Raymond Robert Clark was convicted for the April 27, 1977, kidnapping and execution-style murder of scrap metal dealer David Drake, abducted from a bank parking lot, forced to write a $5,000 ransom check, and shot twice in the head. His teenage accomplice Ty Johnston's subsequent recantations notwithstanding, fiber analysis and Johnston's testimony secured Clark's arrest. A 1979 jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and extortion, recommending death unanimously, and the Florida Supreme Court affirmed on direct appeal. Clark's successive post-conviction motions were denied, and on November 19, 1990, at 7:07 a.m., he was electrocuted in Rayford's electric chair. He offered no final words and ate only the standard prison breakfast. So, this is the end of Part 2.